You know what I love? Controversy. So, a while ago I put out a community post asking you guys for some controversial opinions about Thomas. Books, TV series, anything you wanted. This video is going to be more unscripted, but basically I'm going to be reacting to some of those crazy things that you guys posted there. I'm going to be ranking these hot takes on a scale from strongly agree down to strongly disagree, with agree, unsure, and disagree in the middle of those. A reminder that this is all my opinion, and the takes presented in this video are all your opinions. Let's go! So, our first hot take is from the Brendam Engine, who says, Mountain Engines is one of my favourite Railway series books. The fact that the Culdee Fell Railway only appears in that book is what makes it so mysterious and fascinating. So, I think we're off to a really good start here. I strongly agree with this. Mountain Engines is sadly very overlooked, and while it was never going to be economic to adapt it for TV, I agree that it's a beautiful one-volume treat. Of course, I made a video about Devil's Back, and I'd recommend you all check that out if you haven't already when you're done here. Moving on to Jamjar1, who says Diesel 10 is the most entertaining outside of Magic Railroad. The goofy side of him is great, especially in the missing Christmas decorations from Season 17. So, I completely disagree with this. It's a strong disagree. His role in missing Christmas decorations just kind of turns him into a Diesel clone in a no-stakes situation, whereas I would say that in Magic Railroad he's one of the most entertaining aspects of the movie. For CGI, particularly after Day of the Diesels, they really took all the fear factor out of him. They diminished the effect of his presence. In Magic Railroad, whenever he showed up, you were worried.
Tell me where the buffers are, now!
So, strongly disagree. Next, we have Ben Newbury 2572, who says, I think Thomas was written much better in the show than in the books. He's just too much of a bull in the books. You'd think Edward or Toby or someone would have straightened him out. So I'm going to go disagree on this one. Now, it's not quite a strong disagree, and I'll explain why in a second. I agree that Thomas is pretty awful in the books, but I would say he's also pretty terrible in the show, particularly Season 2. I don't know how much difference there actually is in his characterizations between the books and the first two seasons. From Season 3, he does start to mature, and I do agree it's nice to see him grow up by Season 5, but that doesn't make him a bad character in the first two seasons. For him to mature, he has to be immature first. So, disagree. Christopher Wall 2121 says that of all the new main characters introduced in the late era of the original show, Nia was actually the one who had the least jarring introduction. He reckons that if she wasn't introduced as part of a strange new format, and the characters already created weren't being phased out by that point, he thinks that she would have been taken much better and we'd have really warmed up to her more. I think the last sentence there is pretty key, and it's the reason I agree with this one. The main offensive thing about her was that she replaced Edward. She's kind of a bad character anyway, but without that, I think she'd have just been forgotten about rather than hated. It's also annoying that she turned diversity into kind of a tick on a checklist, rather than actually being an exciting opportunity for new characters. So yeah, mild agree. Ryan... I'm not going to try and pronounce that. Ryan Weber 4096 says, I don't think realism should be applied to every aspect of the show. Sure, there are times when it's needed, but there's no harm in the show just being fun, epic, or wholesome, like in Thomas and the Jet Engine, Rusty and the Boulder, and Henry's Forest. I totally agree with this, strongly agree. Realism is the foundation of Thomas, but it's not the goal, it's not the end point. Real railway practices can and should be used as jumping off points for stories, but for me, character, plot, and writing needs to come first. Next up, we have Dominic F8039, and they say that Duck is the best character in the entire show. I'm going to disagree with this. I don't hate him anymore like I used to, and I think in the books he's brilliant, but he's very far from my top 10. Formula Fish 1536 says that the Railway series either needed to be stopped with Wilbert's retirement, or continued with Christopher having more creative control. They think that if Christopher had been able to write what he wanted, then he would have written more books and they'd be of higher quality. It's a real shame that he couldn't tell the publishers just to shove it and leave him alone. Now, I agree with this. It's almost a strongly agree, but not quite. Chris was not a bad writer, and I think it was mostly the publishers who messed him up. His main flaw as a writer was being very kind of technical in his writing style, but most of the problems with his books did come from those publishers demanding more of Thomas and less of everybody else. Out of all his Thomas-centric books, I would say Thomas and the Twins was the only one for me that I felt actually deserved to have Thomas in that leading role. Isle of Pigs Studios says, Bwubba is a decent movie if you just turn off your brain and treat it as a silly road trip movie. Now, I'm gonna go unsure on this, so I get where you're coming from, but I don't think it should be a road trip movie at all. I think that was actually one of the key problems with it. There wasn't enough focus on railways. I never really understood why it was a Thomas movie. It seemed better to make it a Cars movie or something like that, rather than kind of trying to drag Thomas into it. It almost seemed like Ace was more of a main character than he was, plus all the cartoon shenanigans, and yeah, I'm quite unsure how to feel about this take. German01 Loco says that Charlie and Billy are hated too much. They're underrated and underused. So I kind of agree with this. I don't think people even hate these guys as much as they once did. We've definitely had worse characters since them. But yeah, I agree, they're interesting designs. Charlie in particular isn't kind of garish in terms of his colour scheme. Yeah, it would be interesting to see if the writers wanted to do something with them, although I think all the characters in the reboot are working at Billy level right about now, so, well, you never know. But the point is, I agree with this take, and I think they're not the worst characters the show has ever produced. Thomas and Random Roblox Games says that Season 3 is so overrated. They think it's the worst out of Seasons 1 through 5. So my opinion of Season 3 has gone up over time, and I would say it has an absolutely beautiful look to it. In terms of visuals, although Season 4 and Season 5 are probably more technically impressive, Season 3 really nails that kind of comforting vibe. I completely disagree that it's overrated. If anything, I think people are maybe too critical of it. Another take from this user is also that the movies are really quite good and people are too hard on them. Most of them have incredible music, and there are good aspects in all of them. So I disagree with this take as well. I don't think the specials are generally very good. I would say The Great Discovery is really good, Lost Treasure, Blue Mountain Mystery, The Adventure Begins, and then maybe kind of Hero of the Rails, Tale of the Brave. Those are the ones that stand out to me as actually okay. And that's less than 50% of them. So in terms of track record, if you'll excuse the pun, I don't think the franchise has done very well with movies overall. Friendly Emerald Emily comments on the character they're named after, saying, Emily in the hit era is easily the most interesting iteration of her character. They go on for quite some time about this in a really nice comment. I'd recommend checking it out, but basically they argue that her stubborn nature and her bossy nature makes her a far more interesting character than she was in Season 7. And I absolutely agree with this. In my pretty dated Defense of the Hit era video, this is a point I should have emphasised much more. They sometimes go a bit far with her rudeness, like in Emily's Adventure in Season 8, but generally I much prefer her with that kind of more prickly side to her character. I absolutely agree as well that CGI Emily is a big downgrade. She didn't have any interesting characteristics. Hit Emily supremacy indeed. Clayton Rose says, The Adventure Begins is a better origin story for Thomas than the Audrey-written one. And again, I agree, but only really for Thomas. For the other characters, I felt that movie did them a little bit dirty, particularly Henry. But I would say that Thomas is one of the best bits of it, so I agree on that. The user GlennCleland5849 says that All Engines Go is not that bad. It's not good, but at least it's its own thing, and the toy line is much better than the previous diecast range. This might be the hottest take in this video. Now, I haven't bought any of the merchandise, so I can't comment on that, but for me the fact that it's its own thing is kind of the problem. It's taken the name of Thomas, the character of Thomas, but it's not Thomas. It's taken the name of Sodor, but the creators have been very transparently against what Sodor actually represents from the start, and that makes me really mad. I strongly disagree with this take. I find the reboot fairly easy to ignore, but I'd rather have no franchise at all than whatever this is. NoSama24 says, Edward is one of, if not the most overrated character in the show, and I think that's down to him being the first character. His arc in the Railway series is kinda similar to Henry's, but Henry does it in a far more interesting way. If he had been introduced later, he would not be as loved as he is today. I agree with this again. He is interesting, but definitely overrated. Of the 8 famous engines, I think Henry and Gordon are the most complex, James and Toby are the most fun, maybe add Percy in that group as well, and I feel Edward kind of lags behind those guys on both factors. So I agree. Society Royale says that the good Reverend had a huge moan about Henry's Forest being unrealistic when he wrote a whole story about a railway abandoning one of their precious engines in a tunnel and then boring a whole new tunnel to solve this self-imposed problem. Give your head a wobble, Rev. So, I'm unsure on this one. I agree that Henry's Forest is an insanely good episode that the Reverend was wrong about, and I agree that the sad story of Henry is a bit dumb. But I also think we can kind of counter-react the Reverend a bit too much on this. Like, he had the right to say what he thought. At the end of the day, these were adaptations of his stories that he'd built, a whole universe that he'd meticulously crafted with its in-depth lore, and I do understand his frustrations, even if I disagree with them. Smackamations says, I wish that the Skarloey Railway and the Mid-Sodor Railway in the TV series had different themes. I strongly agree with this. I can understand why they didn't, because the Mid-Sodor only appears like twice, but yeah, I agree with that. It would have added some really nice variety. Avery Productions says, Thomas and Friends is all one canon, and some things, like The Adventure Begins, can be excused as simply the show's way of revisualizing the first season, or some things are just straight-up animation errors. So I strongly disagree with this. I think it's logically impossible, really. Even just the island changing vibe so much kind of destroys this take for me. I would argue that there are probably 5 canons. You've got the Railway series, seasons 1 through 7, seasons 8 through 12 is a kind of extension of the early model seasons, you've got Magic Railroad, and you've got CGI. So yeah, that's a very hot take, and I strongly disagree. Henry and Oliver fan 3115 says, Misty Island Rescue is actually not bad. I recently rewatched it and found it isn't as bad as everyone says, and yeah, there's a bunch of rubbish stuff, but it's really sweet in places, and you can feel the kind of emotion in it. So, I disagree with this, but the reason it's not a strong disagreement is because at least they were trying to do something cool with that movie, unlike Day of the Diesels, which is probably a better movie overall, but not as innovative. Music and atmosphere did have some really good moments. I also came up with a pretty epic theory about Whiff that you can see on my community posts page. It's still a rubbish movie on the whole, though, and so I disagree with this take. Next up, we have 2 opposing takes. Little Owl 2003 says, my least favourite classic series episode is Rusty to the Rescue. It's just Escape 2.0 with absolutely no reason to have Rusty as the main character. Whereas Logan the 9F51 says, Rusty to the Rescue is amazing. I think to answer this question, we kind of need to go to the next hot take, and that's from Caleb C2290, who says, Season 4 sucks. I hate the world building that's set up. Wilbert spent years of careful planning to introduce Duke and the Mid-Sodor Railway, dropping hints, but the TV series completely abandoned that and just made it the opening to the season. So I'm unsure, on the whole, how to feel about this take. So I would kind of agree that Season 4 had a very flawed structure, and I think it was very weakly kind of put together. However, in everything else, technically, musically, and visually, it was absolutely brilliant. Grandpuff is still one of the best episodes of the entire show, but I agree that the flow of events is a lot less satisfying than in the books, particularly when the season is kind of split down the middle, like narrow gauge and standard gauge each being half. Again, I think Rusty to the Rescue is brilliant technically, but it does mess with the canon really badly. Season 4's main problem was, I think, trying to do too much with the narrow gauge engines so early on. I think they should have left the Duke stuff to the back end of Season 5. But yeah, on the whole, I'm unsure about that take, but totally see where you guys are all coming from. The user Jude the Choo Choo says, I don't get the hype around Bear from the Railway series books. He did nothing to contribute anything in the grand scheme of things. I prefer Boko any day. So I strongly agree with this. Bear has been used really well in some fan projects, but in the original books he was just a nothing character really. He was a nice foil to D199, but then when he got sent away, I don't know how much opportunity there was for original stories with Bear. Chris certainly didn't use him very much, and I think that's understandable, and maybe says something about the character. Finally, we have a couple of people, including Cass Reinman7540 and LNERJ15, who say that Season 5 is not that great, too many accidents, and that Season 4 is better. So, I can see that Season 5 does have flaws, but every season does. If you look through the early seasons, each one of them has a glaring issue somewhere, and I would argue that Season 5 is the best of the bunch. There are just so many positives. I think the lore, the world building, and most of all, the variety. Of course there are weaker entries on the list, but I think Season 5 is brilliant, and I disagree with these takes for that reason. So those were some of the most interesting hot takes from you guys, but I thought that I'd include 4 of my own hot takes, and you can react to these however you want in the comments. So first of all, The Great Discovery is the best Thomas movie. I've talked about this before, but I absolutely love everything about that movie. From the kind of the visual components, bringing out all the old models, it's got such a kind of colour and it really pops, I think, on the screen. I also think the lore edition is really cool, kind of building on the past elements of Soto's history. Secondly, I've kind of addressed this already, but my second hot take is I don't really care for The Adventure Begins. It's a really cool novelty, and it was great to see that, the crew did care about the show's history once upon a time, but it actually strikes me as quite low effort in places, particularly compared to Brenner's other movies. Third hot take, Season 7 is much better than Season 6, particularly on account of amazing new characters and a much better colour palette that isn't as boring to look at. And fourthly and finally, the 3 big engines are by far the best written characters in the whole show. There are other contenders in the Railway series books like Lord Harry, who I talked about in the Devil's Back video, and again, other fan favourites just don't come close for me. Edward and Duck have cool quirks, but they're not really as developed as Gordon and Henry are. James is also tons of fun, even though he doesn't have that kind of same multi-story arc that the other 2 do. I really hope you enjoyed listening to my rambling at the end there, and thank you to everyone who submitted hot takes for this video. It's been really fun to make a kind of more unscripted, kind of casual video for once, and we'll be returning to normal, so kind of scripted videos very shortly. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.